Well, time now for The View, looking at the opinion pages of today's newspapers. And the Spectator editor Fraser Nelson writes in the Daily Telegraph that he's unconvinced by Theresa May's war on plastic. He says the Tories are keener to save themselves than the planet. Brooks' cartoon in The Times suggests another reason for Michael Gove's newfound fondness for recycling. He's part of the recycled old rubbish, according to Brooks. In The Eye, Theresa May's former advisor Will Tanner says his old boss needs to think bigger than reshuffles and target a revolution in Westminster with reform to party funding and the honours system. Martin Kettle in The Guardian argues it's time for Jeremy Corbyn to abandon caution on Brexit and come up fighting for single market membership. In The Times, the Institute for Fiscal Studies director Paul Johnson makes the case for scepticism about politicians' promises of fairness. He says the word obscures the hard choices facing the country. Ross Wyn-Jones takes aim at the reappointment of Esther McVey as DWP Secretary in the Daily Mirror. She promises that her return will be met with deep resistance. And Steve Bell in The Guardian takes on Nigel Farage's call for a second EU referendum. Clearly, he sees it as something of a cry for help from the UKIP leader in the dustbin there, saying, "Give my life meaning again." Well, joining me now is the Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation think tank, Miatta Fahnbulleh, and the Telegraph columnist, Juliet Samuel. Welcome to you both. Now, this plastics business, in your paper, Fraser Nelson having a go, what do you make of that?
Well, I think that actually a lot of Fraser's article is about the reason that the government might be doing this rather than the substance of the debate on plastic. And I think it relates to the cartoon on Gove as well, which is that part of the reason that the whole agenda has suddenly gone towards recycling and plastic is that Gove and that department is the only one coming up with any energetic, dynamic policies at all. And so when Fraser Nelson writes that the Tories are thinking about saving themselves, it's partly because we have such a moribund centre to the government, such an empty number 10 with nothing coming out, that the only department where stuff is coming out has suddenly distorted the whole agenda, and it's all been focused on that.
I mean, he also makes the point that if you look at polling, green policy is one area which is up for grabs between the parties.
Absolutely. So, I mean, he sort of characterised this as Theresa May's hug a husky moment, and this is an attempt to kind of claim a good cause that helps the Tory brand. But in the end, there's no real bite behind it. I mean, if you look at the 25-year environmental plan, I don't think I'd call it dynamic or energetic. And actually, the bottom line, and I think he's absolutely right in his article, is that there are some big environmental challenges facing us as a country. We're hitting a crunch point. We've got about a window of 10, 15 years to take some urgent action. And you get a sense that we're sleepwalking into a crisis, that the government isn't taking it seriously. They had a chance to go big on the environmental plan, and I think most of the kind of green movement would argue that actually they just missed that chance. Important things, but doesn't nearly solve the problem.
I mean, it did seem to me that, frankly, it's one of Fraser's weaker columns because he talks about the benefits of plastic, but he only gives one sentence to the central issue, which is about plastics in the ocean, which really is the reason why.
Yes, I think there's an element of contrarianism to it. A consensus has developed, and it's true that consensus can be a dangerous thing. And he makes the point that, then policy gets made with little scrutiny. And I think it's fair to say that if we're going to phase out plastic, what will replace it, and will it be worse, or will we somehow just export the problem as we do in other situations?
Well, not anymore. The Chinese don't want it.
Well, no, they're stopping that. But I think that that he doesn't really address the point of what do we do with all this plastic that's clogging up the ocean and the planet.
OK, now, fairness. What do you make of that, Miatta? Basically, Paul Johnson says one person's fairness is another person's unfairness. Politicians bang on about it, but it's not really very helpful.
No, absolutely. And I mean, this is an interesting article from Paul. And I mean, he's arguing that who doesn't want to be associated with fairness? So across the political spectrum, everyone is trying to claim the mantle of fairness. And he thinks it's mute because actually it's based on perception. It can be misrepresented. I think that's a bit unfair because I think there is a deep deep underlying sense of fairness in the country. And the reason why both the Tory manifesto and the Labour manifesto was peppered with this term is because they're trying to respond to that. I think the problem and the challenge is that actually the sorts of ideas that we're talking about to try and tackle fairness just don't cut it. And he is right that actually until the country has a serious conversation about what kind of society we want, what kind of economy we want, what do we think about things like inequality, distribution of wealth, what kind of state we want, we won't get to the root cause of it. And on that I absolutely agree with him.
I mean, that's really the point, is fairness the same thing as equality?
I think what he's reflecting is that, yes, there's a clash of values that goes on, and it tends to get obscured by the word fairness because, as he says, it obscures lots of different ideas. The word fairness is used to portray the idea that someone who disagrees with you is evil and believes in injustice, when in fact what he's saying, I think, is that there are legitimate competing values and competing interests at play here, and that's the debate that we don't get into when we use the word fairness and we try to sort of rule people out of the debate by saying they don't believe in it.
What about Esther McVey? I mean, she is from Liverpool and she's a Tory and she's working in the Department of Welfare, and seems to some people that just doesn't compute.
Yeah, so, I mean, her appointment has been hugely controversial. She's got a lot of grief, and I have to say, personal attacks on politicians, I think, is absolutely wrong. And I think some of the kind of attacks that have been launched at her are just undefensible. But there is a kind of deeper question, which is this government has driven through some very, very aggressive welfare reforms. And for some of the people at the sharp end, and, you know, she talks about an example of an ex-soldier, which is just absolutely heartbreaking. For them, it has been real, it has been vicious, and it's been very, very difficult. And I think the challenge for Esther going into the department is, if the evidence is telling you that your welfare reforms are not delivering the thing that you wanted them to do, which is in the end to help people, I generally believe that, but if it's not doing that, you need to stop and you need to rethink.
But she goes in, I mean, in this article, she goes in with the most severe examples alleging that people have died because of the government's welfare reforms, and that the minister's been insensitive to that. Do you think that's, to kind of phrase, fair?
I think that accusing ministers of murder for their policies is rather extreme. I think that it does reflect perhaps a shift in the debate from when George Osborne was first bringing in austerity, which was that he always thought that welfare cuts were a popular thing. And I think we're now reaching the point where perhaps that has shifted, and I'm not sure that politicians like Esther McVey have quite grasped the language and the different environment because of the point that austerity has come to, and particularly it hitting working people as well.
And of course, Esther McVey is to a certain extent a protege of George Osborne.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, in the end, I think there's a really interesting piece, which is, you know, ministers, and this comes to the sort of heart of the issue with Westminster, they come up with these ideas, they drive these reforms, but it's the kind of connection, understanding of how it has an impact on real people's lives. And I think that if anything, the criticism is when you go in there and say, look, our policies are not having an impact on people going into food bank, and that's just patently wrong and not true, you do have to wonder about both their judgment and their awareness. And you're like, get out there, talk to people, see the impact of the things that you're doing, because it will help you make better policy.
All right, Brexit. We've been putting it off. We got there now. Martin Kettle, he says that it's time for Jeremy Corbyn to shift to a more pro-European position, which he points out is supported by the majority of his MPs and indeed the majority of his supporters.
Yes, I think this is what a lot of the core Remain commentators and political classes would love and have been calling for, but I don't really see what the Labour Party has to gain from shifting from its position at the moment, which has been essentially to be ambiguous, to be to look like you're saying what everyone wants you to say, and to therefore have no position, so that everyone can sort of project onto you what they want to hear.
He did say this week we couldn't stay in the single market.
Well, I mean, that changes depending on which week it is. Keir Starmer says we should be in the single market, then Corbyn says we shouldn't, and John McDonnell says we want the benefits of the single market but not to be in it.
What do you think? Should he move?
The politics are a nightmare for Labour, and this is what Martin Kettle sort of refers to. The members, the movement, the voters are Remainers, but its core constituents, its heartland, voted to leave. So you can understand why there has been this kind of fudge. But I think he is right. At some point, Labour need to lead on this issue. And for me, their approach and their tact has to be, if you believe that people voted to leave, in part because they were sick of the state of the economy, they were frustrated with their lot, they don't feel that, frustrated with housing, don't feel their children have the kind of prospects that they thought they would do, then your approach to Brexit has to respond to that, and it certainly can't make it worse. So something like the single market, you've got to come to it thinking, well, actually, what will help millions of people's lives be better? And if a hard Brexit or leaving the single market doesn't do it, it's a bit of a no-brainer.